Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending this event sponsored by the New England chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. My name is Elle Tusi, and we're here tonight with Louis M. Simmons, a foreign correspondent whose career with the Associated Press, the Washington Post, Time, Night Writer, and newspapers spanned 50 years. Simons won numerous awards during his career. He was a two-time Pulitzer finalist, a George Polk winner, and was an Edward R. Murrow Fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1986, he won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for exposing the billions that the Marcos family looted from the Philippines. Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism named the series one of the 50 greatest stories of the century. He is the author of the recently published book, To Tell the Truth, My Life as a Foreign Correspondent. Sir Louis, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. So I always loved starting these conversations by going back to the beginning. So your career started in 1964 when you were a reporter for the Associated Press. What initially got you into journalism?
Really, one person. I had a rather checkered academic career. Wasted a lot of time in high school and in college. And then I went into the Marine Corps, and that sort of straightened me out, or it went a long way to straightening me out. And I came back to New York, where I'd been living before I enlisted, and got a job in the mailroom of ABC television in New York City, Midtown. And it wasn't much of a job, but I didn't really deserve much of a job at that point. I didn't have many credentials behind me. So the positive part of the job, which was simply to deliver mail throughout the building, was that I got to meet all the people to whom I was bringing mail. And I met one person in particular whose name was Al Seaton. And Al was himself a veteran of the U.S. Navy. He'd been in Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked. Had a million stories to tell. Was a great yarn spinner. And as I got to know him, I learned that he had graduated from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism and had worked for several years as a reporter in Providence, Rhode Island. And it was he who got me interested in journalism, in writing, and gave me the opportunity to do professional writing, even though in a very limited way, writing on-air promotions for various ABC soap operas and detective stories. And then he encouraged me to apply to Columbia. And I have to assume that it was his influence that got me in, because I certainly didn't have the academic chops. And and once I got to Columbia, uh, it became clear to me over not too much time that I wanted to do this, that I believed I could do it, and I couldn't think of any better aspect of journalism than being a foreign correspondent. I also, by the way, met a fellow student who, after a year, agreed to marry me. And so the two of us were young kid journalists. Starting out, we left Columbia and got married and went to Denver. That was my first assignment with the AP. My wife, Carol, went to work for the Denver Post. And 15 months later, the AP sent me to Saigon to be a member of the AP bureau covering the war. By that time, Carol was working in New York for CBS television, and she was able to keep her job. So she went
Um, I believe you're muted. I mean, if it's okay, let me see. You may have lost your audio.
Okay, how about
Oh,
now?
perfect, perfect.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened.
Mm.
Um, I had initially thought once I came out of Columbia and went to work for AP, I had originally wanted to go to Africa. I thought
Mm.
somehow I believed that Africa was going to be the story of the coming century. And AP went along with that. They were getting me ready to go. I was making contacts and learning background, and then all of a sudden they needed a warm body in South Vietnam, and they elected me, and I went and never looked back. Never regretted. I never worked in Africa after that. I visited, but never regretted being in Asia for all those years.
That's incredible. So I know you mentioned Mr. Seaton, and would it be safe to say that he is somewhat of a mentor, the person that kind of helped shape the beginning of your career?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. It was. I can't think of too many mentors that I had
Mm.
over the years. There were a couple, but uh, he definitely got me started. And interestingly enough, when my book came out a couple of months ago, I got a phone call uh, one day, a woman who identified herself as Al Seaton's daughter. Al died a number of years ago.
Wow.
She had heard about my book from a cousin or somebody, bought it, and was just thrilled to see that I had mentioned her dad and credited him with all that he so richly deserved.
That's so incredible. So I feel as if mentors are really important getting into the industry. What would you recommend to journalists that are starting out? What to look for in a mentor, and what does that approach look like? What does that relationship look like that would be a successful mentorship?
Hmm. It's an obvious and an excellent question. I'm afraid I'll do my best to answer it, but I'm afraid that qualifications both for the young person starting out and um, the experience and background of the mentor have changed dramatically since my time.
Mm.
Um, you know, when I left Asia in the mid 1980s, social platforms were unheard of. We were still depending on knocking on doors and making phone calls and wearing out our shoe leather to get our stories. And not to say that correspondents all over the world are not still doing much the same, but the access that is now available uh, online and through all the various electronic connections that one has access to. This has changed things dramatically. So um, I'm not quite sure if I were looking for someone to help guide me, the kind of person I would look for, but that person very certainly would be a different kind of person than Al Seaton was. Um, it, the person would need to have a whole lot of technical knowledge that just does not exist, did not exist in my time. But based on my own experience, I would say that not necessarily in lieu of a mentor, but in addition to a mentor, going to a graduate school of journalism is a pretty good idea. It made all the difference for me. It got
Yeah.
me my first job with AP, and got me really to the basics of understanding what journalism was all about. Prior to my time, a decade before 15 years before I went to work for AP, it was not at all uncommon for young journalists to have been copy boys, as we used
Mm.
to say, to have come to work during high school or right after high school, to lack a college degree. In fact, having a college degree, let alone having a graduate degree, as I did, was cause for a lot of mockery. Even then, oh, here
Wow.
comes the college boy, that kind of stuff. It's different now. The demands on one's real knowledge have changed and increased dramatically. And so I would recommend at least thinking about applying to a graduate school, not an undergraduate course. I
Right.
think there are undergraduate programs that people really need for education, real education. Graduate School of Journalism is the beginning of training, and that's definitely a very real part of what we do.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that once you had your position with the AP, that there was training involved to send you off to Saigon. What was that training like then? And is that different from what we're seeing with training now?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, in fact, to be perfectly candid about it, I barely knew where I was going when
Mm.
Carol and I got on an airplane, Pan Am One, and left New York City for, well, we couldn't even fly directly. We had to overnight in Honolulu, and then after a
Wow.
couple of days there, we went on to Saigon. But I didn't have any training. Um, I, I I certainly did not speak Vietnamese. Uh,
Right.
I certainly did not know the history of the place. The training, if you want to call it that, was on the job training, OJT.
Wow.
Um, one just hung around the bureau for a couple of days, uh, listening to what other people were doing and getting a few contact names in the field, and then one day off you went, and you were on your own. And unfortunately, this is less a matter of journalism that I'm about to go into, but more a matter of American history and foreign policy. Unfortunately, what I just said about myself and my colleagues um, was very much the case for the military and the diplomatic service. People just kind of showed up, and I'm not sure that that has changed or improved a great deal. At the time of the first uh, Iraq War,
Mm.
um, I had begun writing for the National Geographic here in Washington. They were sending me abroad, mostly to Asia. And the editor I was working with told me that the whole place was turned upside down that particular day because the Pentagon had called and they needed every map of Iraq that the National Geographic could provide them. They were so totally
Wow.
unprepared. So uh, this is a problem that exists in American culture. We don't think very much about other countries until those countries are standing in our way or causing us one kind of a problem or another. And because journalism tends to follow diplomacy and foreign policy,
Mhm.
the press is often caught up short when the red balloon goes up.
Right. And I just want to give a reminder for those that are joining us. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll go ahead and have those answered for you at the end of the conversation. And I think that kind of transitions to my next question for you. I want to really talk about your time as a foreign correspondent with the Vietnam War.
Mm.
What was that like, and how was your war coverage? How has that changed since then?
Covering a war, is
Yeah.
that specifically what you're
Right.
asking? Um, I guess the biggest change that that took place for war correspondents um, came in Iraq when the US military, reacted to the way the way the reporting had gone during the Vietnam War. Those of us who covered Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, but particularly Vietnam, were had remarkable access and freedom to cover U.S. forces fighting in southern Vietnam. It was pretty much a matter of going out to Tan Son Nhut Airport in Saigon early in the morning without any forewarning or arrangements being made, and just wait till or ask around who's flying up to wherever we're going, Central Highlands, Da Nang, wherever we wanted to go. And sooner or later, somebody would say, "Oh, that guy's taking a chopper out. He'll take you." Or there's the plane going, and off we'd go. And then spend a day or days or weeks with a unit in the field, nobody interfering, no senior officer or NCO coming over and just saying, "Hey, wait a minute, he can't answer, that soldier can't, or that Marine can't answer that question. Don't ask him questions like." We're just wide open. I'm not saying that they didn't try to influence us, but most of that that kind of exaggeration or lying took place at official briefings that were held in Saigon. In the field, you were there. You were part of the unit. We dressed like soldiers. That was required, and some of us, not me, but some of us carried weapons just for their own safety and protection. Anyway, the military came out of Vietnam convinced that giving access like that to journalists worked against the war effort, that we knew too much, we saw too much, and we were, after an initial sort of honeymoon period where the reporter would be utterly one-sided and sympathetic to the Americans, would begin to see, hey, wait a minute, what's this guy doing? And things just started reporting what we saw, rather than having our preconceived notions come through our writing. The military didn't like it. So in Iraq, they began embedding. It's a term I think that even journalists today still know. We were, not we, I was not part of that, but reporters embedded with a particular unit, and the military limited their access, limited where and when they could go and what they could do. And I don't think it was beneficial to anybody. Most importantly, I don't think it was beneficial to the reading or viewing or listening public. They were not getting a fair and honest appraisal of what was happening. But that's the way that went. What's happening now, of course, in the current war is a totally different story. This is, at least superficially, a foreign war between two foreign countries. And although our part is critical, there's no Americans on the ground pushing the journalists around. This is a whole different ball game.
So the current situations, the conflicts that are taking place right now, which ones have captured your attention?
Well, I think that the the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the
Right.
obvious answer. I'm fascinated by it. I think for the reporters, it's extremely dangerous.
Right.
There have been a number of serious injuries and a few deaths. Of course, we had plenty of deaths and injuries in Vietnam as well.
Right.
But if you're an American journalist, I was always happy in Vietnam to be able to bounce things off of American military people in the
Right.
field. I might spend some time with a Vietnamese unit, although I didn't spend much time with them because this was an American
Right.
war as far as Americans were concerned. But I did spend some time with them, and then I would be able to check with the American version of the people I was with and say, what do you think about them? Are they doing what they should, what they can? Uh, and they were, and you would almost always get an honest assessment. And I do think and worry a bit about what kind of information American journalists are getting now in Ukraine.
Right.
They have virtually no access to the other side, to the Russians. So it's a one-sided reporting job that's going on through nobody's fault. Just has to be
Right.
that way. Um, and I'm not sure how honest it the reporting is. It's if you watch it on television, cable news, if you read it in the major dailies, you
Right.
see, at least we have seen until very recently that yes, the Ukrainians are being hit hard, but they're incredibly brave and courageous, and they're giving as much as they're getting, and
Mhm.
that's beginning to shift just now for the first time. And I just wonder if it's not a little late. But I'm not. Don't get me wrong, please. I
Sure.
am not criticizing. I'm not finding fault at all. Covering any war
It's
anywhere
difficult.
is a terrible and a terribly hard job.
Absolutely. I'm curious, how are you consuming your news these days? Is it with you're talking about social media before, and I'm curious to see how are you getting your news?
The old-fashioned way, I still read the New York Times, the Washington Post every day, both online and on paper.
Beautiful.
I'm getting a little annoyed with the paper edition of both because the much of the news is not news anymore by the
Right.
time it's in the paper. I've read it online days, even a couple of weeks before sometimes. And I watch cable news. I watch CNN pretty much
Okay.
on a daily basis. I watch as much Fox as I can stomach, which is not much.
Yeah.
And and then I'm because of the book, I'm now writing about the book and about events occurring now that relate to my background, my history, and the book. So I'm in front of the computer all day long, every day,
Right.
and I'm continually looking around for something breaking or some new and good
Right.
analysis. And there
Right.
there's plenty. There's
Right.
plenty up
Right.
there.
Lots of access to different things, right?
Hmm.
So early in your career, one of your editors had once snapped, "No one gives a damn what you think." So what
Hmm.
exactly happened and how important was this moment for you?
Yeah, it was a critical moment. I mean, here I am, 60 years later, roughly, and I can visualize and hear the whole thing in my
Mm.
head as if it was just 20 minutes ago.
Wow.
Yeah, AP was getting me ready, as I say, to go to Africa. Um, and so I worked on the foreign desk overnight, which meant that all the incoming reporting from AP correspondents and abroad would pass through me.
Right.
And I don't know what what it's like in a wire service today. I think it's probably a whole lot more sophisticated than it was then. But it was not at all uncommon for AP reporters abroad, particularly because of time differences and so forth, to not have time to write a story at all, or to write it very roughly, and
Right.
sometimes just dictate over the phone from notes. So there was a lot to do on the desk, and I guess I got carried away this one night and started putting in some of my own analysis of what I don't remember the exact piece anymore or what country it was from, but
Yeah.
uh, I obviously put my 2 cents in, and it was 2 cents more than my superior, my editor, wanted. And this fellow came over. He was a cranky guy anyway, and he came over and shouted in my face, "Nobody gives a damn what you think." And I realized that that was a big part of the job. I and it stuck with me. There's no
Right.
question about it. Certainly, my 7 years with AP, that's the kind of copy I wrote. It was strictly um, factual. Uh, there would be color, but there would no interpretation. That
Right.
was just because nobody gave a damn, and I believe that. Now, Vietnam went a long way to changing that attitude for AP
Mhm.
and pretty much for all of the major news outlets, because there was so much conflict. I don't mean just in on the battlefield, but between what was going on the ground in Vietnam, what was going on around the country in the United States, in Washington, every major city, small towns. As kids were protesting, college students were
Right.
protesting, um, police were out beating up people, and so on. The whole country was being torn apart by the
Wow.
Vietnam War, and something more than just comma unquote he said was required to make this understandable, at least to some degree, to the reader and viewer. So we were not just allowed but asked for a certain amount of interpretation. But what has happened since then, and I think particularly since the birth of the internet, if you will, and everybody being able to design their own version of news. In
Right.
fact, everybody being their own version of a reporter or a photographer. Everybody with a
Mhm.
with a telephone is now a photographer. Some of it is amazing. You get stuff that was never possible. But because of that, uh, editors began encouraging their reporters and their desk editors to have more and more to say, and then to go out and tweet
Mhm.
themselves, or to post on other media, and or to show up after having written a story during the day, show up at the CNN newsroom at 7 o'clock in the evening, and tell things that didn't appear in print, that kind of thing.
Right.
uh, I believe has gone a long way to damaging the respect and reliability of the press writ large
Right.
among the American news consuming public. Uh, this is I'm getting off track a little bit, but certainly regard for journalists and journalism is at rock bottom right now. Although God
Right.
knows it could get worse, I suppose.
Right.
And we as journalists kind of look elsewhere for the reason. We looked at I admitted I looked at Donald Trump. I think there's no question that Donald Trump went a long way to destroying Americans' faith and respect for journalism. But and so did a whole lot of other politicians,
Right.
and and hosts on cable TV and so forth. But we journalists have to admit and acknowledge that we bear a certain responsibility ourselves. And I'm not recommending that we go back to the comma unquote he said story, because nobody will read that anymore. But there's got to be a line somewhere that makes it clear to the consumer that this is actually what I saw and heard and witnessed today. But let me tell you what I think it meant, or what people around me think it meant. There's got to be a distinction. I'm shocked by the number of people I find now that I'm back in the States, educated people, adults, who do not literally do not understand the distinction between what appears on the editorial page, the op-ed page, and the front page. They don't know. It's all news. It's all, it's all the Washington Post. It's all the New York Times. And that's not no good. It can't be allowed to go on without destroying our business.
Right. And kind of piggyback off of you mentioning this, what's your take on citizen journalism? I get this question a lot about, like you mentioned earlier, anyone that has a camera, anyone that can post something on social media. It feels different than from the era when you were covering it earlier in your career, where there was like a certain respect, right?
Oh, no, there's no question. I mean, look, reporters, journalists have always had access to the public to one degree or another. In other words, for example, when I joined the Washington Post in the early 1970s, I got almost immediately I got involved in the war that was building up at that time between India and Pakistan over what was East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. I was on the foreign desk at the Post, and it was clear that nobody in Washington knew very much about what was happening out there. Why did we care? Richard Nixon was president. Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. They hated the Indians, so people didn't really know. And the administration, the Nixon administration, began taking action that was against India and was meant to help Pakistan crush this rebellion in their eastern wing. And they were going about it in a very cruel and vicious way. How do I know that? How did I know it then? I started getting anonymous phone calls from people in the State Department, people in the Pentagon, tips, leaks, the leak culture. So that's always been around. But now there's no need for that, really. If somebody wants to leak, they can, of course, still do it the old way, but they can also go online themselves. They can also send, post photographs themselves. Is it good? Is it bad? It's probably a mix of both. There's certainly, I mean, I see so often on television news coverage these narrow pictures that are blurry on the side because they're coming off of a telephone. And, there's only so much that a photo staff, even a large photo staff that a few of the major papers still have, can do. Now you've got people everywhere in the world, everywhere.
Right.
In the most backward, underdeveloped countries, they still have those camera phones.
Right.
And so you're getting stuff that was never conceivable before. That's good. But when people start voicing their own biases, their own prejudices, their own hatreds, their likes, and so forth, without any explanation as to who is this person and why is she saying this or writing that, that becomes a problem. It becomes dangerous and counterproductive.
Right. So I wanted to talk to you about, you've been involved with some of the biggest events in the 20th century. I'm going to list a few of them because it's so important. The Tiananmen Square massacre in China, the bloody coups in Thailand, the attempted genocide and societal collapse in Cambodia, the economic advance and decline and rebirth in Japan, your time in India, reporting on the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's political misuse of the armed forces. That's really impressive resume for a foreign correspondent. So I'm curious to see, what was the most memorable for you? And did you know that at that time, like, this historical significance of these events when you're reporting on them?
Yeah. Um, to answer your second question, yes, and we'll get back to that. But the most important and the most memorable, undoubtedly, was the investigation that two colleagues of the San Jose Mercury News and I did in the Philippines.
Mm.
Um, it's a long, long story. It took us the greater part of 2 years to report it and to write the series. But the essence of it was that I was based in Tokyo for Knight Ridder and the San Jose Mercury, which was owned by Knight Ridder at the time, and uh, I had secondary responsibility for much of Southeast Asia, so I was on the road a lot. In the spring of 1985, um, a man by the name of Ninoy Aquino was murdered, assassinated at Manila Airport as he returned from exile in the United States. Aquino was about to challenge Ferdinand Marcos, who was then the authoritarian president of the Philippines, had been for 20 years. And the people around the president feared Aquino. They knew he could very likely win a fair election. And they decided to take him out literally before he stepped 1 foot onto Philippine soil. They had him shot as he descended from the aircraft. So I happened to be in California at the time with my family. We were just beginning our summer break, and I dropped everything, including my wife and two little kids, and flew back to the Philippines. And so covered that story. And as I began getting into it and getting to know more and more people, I began hearing rumors, gossip about illicit properties that the president Marcos and his wife Imelda Marcos and their cronies, as they were called, owned, largely in the United States, largely in Manhattan, some on Long Island, quite a bit in the Bay Area of California, and other places outside the United States, as well as lots and lots of money salted away in shell companies in the Caribbean and in
Wow.
Switzerland. So after a while, I began realizing that I wasn't getting facts, I was getting gossip, but there was so much of it, and it was so widely held that there had to be, I recognized there had to be something to it. So I eventually put together, I can't remember exactly how long the memo was, but it was many, many pages. I sent it to my editor in San Jose. The foreign editor's name was Jonathan Krim, and he recognized that there was, as I said, something there.
Right.
He passed it on to the paper's senior investigative reporter, a fellow by the name of Pete Carey. Pete was one of the pioneers in using the internet for research, and he recognized that by tapping into real estate records that were used around the country,
Wow.
he could begin to determine who owned various buildings. And that's what he did. Eventually, the paper brought in another reporter, a young woman named Catherine Ellison, and she was basically the door knocker who went around and confronted Filipinos who had property in the Bay Area
Wow.
saying, "Hey, listen, what do you want to say about this? We here are the records. We know you own this building. It's worth X million dollars. How did you do it? You've got a peanuts job in the Philippine government, so on." And
Wow.
anyway, we we put together a 3-day series of articles that became known as hidden billions, not millions, but billions, because we determined that they had ripped off about $10 billion
Wow.
from one of the poorest countries in the world. And that series of articles led directly to people, much of the population of the Philippines, taking to the streets, demonstrating against Aquino and demanding elections, which the Ronald Reagan administration, which was then in power, forced him to do. Despite his best efforts at cheating, he lost the election, uh, although he never admitted it. It was very much a precursor to the Biden
Wow.
Trump election here. There was actually a moment when both of them, I should say
Wow.
both of them, the opposition, the person who beat him was appropriately Ninoy Aquino's widow, Cory Aquino. So the Philippines got its first woman president. Marcos was overthrown, fled the country to Hawaii, where he died, and we won the Pulitzer for that series. The Pulitzer Archive said that that series changed the whole nature of the international reporting Pulitzer Prizes. It was entered in the congressional record, and so it was a big deal.
Right.
There's no getting around it. It was a big deal, and so of course, I'm that's the story, my big story.
Oh, I mean, it's an incredible story. And, you're talking about the Philippines, and it just made me think about, I want to say about maybe last year or 2 years ago, I had the honor of interviewing Mary Ressa.
Mm,
And I'm curious to kind of see, have you been following what's been happening with Maria in the Philippines currently? And
yeah.
what was that experience for you reporting at that time? Was there respect for reporters then, at least for you to do your work, or are you like, what are the differences or similarities that you're seeing with what happened to Maria and how you reported at that time in the
Mm.
Philippines?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and multifaceted. I know Maria a little bit, probably
Hmm.
not as well as you do. She was working for CNN in
Right.
Southeast Asia when I was there, and then she came back to Manila and went to work for a domestic television
Right.
network where essentially she still is.
Yeah.
Um,
Rappler.
and sorry.
The Rappler, I believe.
Yeah, well,
Or
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, she
Yeah.
went
Yeah.
from a network which was, I can't
Like a
remember,
local. Right. Right.
yeah,
Right.
a domestic one, and then started Rappler, um, and of course won the Nobel Prize and has just recently released or published a memoir.
Right.
Um, Maria is the quintessential example of the really gutsy, courageous, life-risking reporter. I mean, she did much of that while she was covering other countries in Southeast Asia, but the rubber hit the road when she came back to Manila,
Right.
because she's a local person. I mean, she
Right.
actually has dual citizenship, U.S. Philippine citizenship, but she was a local person, and she was subject to them in a way that I and my foreign correspondent colleagues never were. So for me, I had some warnings from friends, Philippine friends, saying, "Be careful. They're watching you. They know where you're going." As I would go out on my reporting every day, for the uh, both for the assassination story and then later for the investigative story. Be careful. Be careful. But uh, to tell the truth, I never truly felt that I was at risk, that I was threatened.
Right.
I have no doubt they were listening in on my phone calls, and they knew from the taxi drivers where I was going, and they knew what I was up to. But they were limited as to what they could do or would do for the Philippines. Being specifically a former U.S. colony and being very much beholden to the United States for financial aid and military aid, to throw out a, a U.S. citizen reporter would be a step too far, even
Right.
for the Marcos government. But and besides that, I was at that time working, as I said to you, for the San Jose Mercury News. This was
Right.
not the New York Times. This was not NBC television. It was just, they themselves demeaned it locally as a medium-sized regional paper in California. Who cares? So that was a big part of it. But for Maria and for domestic reporters, they were thrown in jail. They were threatened. They were killed. Absolutely. I couldn't give you numbers, but they're still being killed.
Right.
And um, that's that's the case in a lot of countries. I got expelled from India some years after or before, I should say, before the Philippines, when I was working for the Washington Post. I was the post correspondent in Delhi following the Bangladesh War. I got expelled. But what did that really mean? Well, that meant I had to hustle out of there with 5 hours notice, and I left my wife and two babies behind. They suffered, but it was over
Right.
in a matter of 2 weeks. For the Indian journalists who stayed behind, who were there, they were thrown in jail. My
Wow.
notes were confiscated. My notebooks were confiscated as I was being ushered onto the plane going to Bangkok from New Delhi. Those I got those notebooks back. There were dozens of them. About a
Wow.
year later, they were sent to me through the U.S. Embassy channel. I got them in Bangkok, where I was then located. Uh, every person I interviewed and every journalist, local journalist I spoke with, who I named and jotted into my notes, was underlined in red, and they all went to jail.
Wow.
So that was a horrible thing for me, to be responsible for that. That was a terrible burden that I've never overcome. But for them, it meant real suffering,
Right.
and that continues now in India right now.
Right.
You have a classic example took place about a month ago. The government cracked down, the Indian government cracked down on the BBC, which had
Hmm.
a very large presence in Mumbai, former Bombay, and Delhi. Uh, Police swarmed in and took away their records and took away the reporters' phones, charged the company with tax fraud.
Wow.
It's nasty, it's ugly, but the local reporters are being arrested
Right.
still.
As a teaching them a lesson, right?
Yeah.
For all those involved.
Yeah.
Were there ever moments where you feared for your safety or your life while reporting on any of these stories in any locations?
Well, sure. I mean, in Vietnam,
Right.
you know, when I was in the field, I was pretty much in the same position as any GI or Marine, and so if they were under threat, I was under threat.
Right.
There were times when there was one time in particular, the first time in my life, even though I had already been through the Marine Corps, uh, the first time in my life where I was personally being shot at by a bad guy. That was during the Tet Offensive in the imperial city of Hue, when some sniper, a North Vietnamese sniper, spotted me trying
Whoa.
to cross a road on my belly and opened fire on me. That was not a happy moment. But was I frightened? The truth is, I could never have anticipated this. It's only in retrospect and in having had the experience that I was more angry than I was afraid. What the hell is that guy shooting at me for? Don't you know I'm a journalist? And I shouted in the few 3 or 4 Vietnamese words that I knew. I'm a journalist. I'm a journalist, you idiot. But I was too busy and too preoccupied and too fascinated and amazed by everything that was going on around me to be truly frightened, or maybe just not smart enough to be truly frightened.
My goodness. So do you think your background being in the Marine Corps helped you in your journalism career?
Oh, for sure. It I had a very undistinguished military career. I was not a very good Marine, but yeah, interestingly enough, it turned out, I learned this later, that is why, because of that experience, it is why the AP pulled me off of the Africa track and sent me to Vietnam. And it's kind of a telling story. AP at that time in Vietnam uh, was among the first of the majors, along with the New York Times, to recognize that what was happening on the ground in Vietnam was futile, that there was no way that the United States, big, powerful United States, was going to defeat this miserable little hard scrabble army of guerrillas in the South and bicycle riding soldiers in the North. And they began reporting that. A fellow, a very famous reporter by the name of Peter Arnett led that charge for AP. And the government, the United States government at every level from the White House on down through State Department and Pentagon was furious. And as I say, the New York Times had a couple of young reporters on the ground who began doing the same kind of, delivering the same kind of news. And the American authorities were furious. And the AP concluded that, hey, this kid Simons, 26 years old at the time, he's been in the Marine Corps. In fact, his hair is still cut kind of short. He was gung ho, and I believed at that time in the war. I thought the United States had it right, and I also thought that we would win. I couldn't see that any way that we couldn't win. So they decided at the very highest level of AP that by sending this former young Marine, gung-ho, pro-war guy to the Saigon Bureau of AP would help them defend themselves against the accusations that Simons we don't have to tell him. He'll get on the team. This was the terminology that the American officials used in Vietnam to journalists. Get on the team. What you're writing is anti-American. It's not patriotic. Get on the team. And I anticipated I would be on the team because I believed. And I started out that way. And then I began to see that two things were happening. I would go out on an operation sometimes for just a day or two and come back, and then go across the street from the AP Bureau to a theater that the Americans operated, where they held daily briefings called the 5 o'clock Follies. And very often, something I had just witnessed with my own eyes and written about was being reported or relayed to the several hundred foreign correspondents in the audience, and it was a whole different story. And I realized I was being lied to. And then I realized what I was seeing in the field was not good from an American perspective. So I changed. Fortunately for AP, I guess, because I still had that lesson of nobody gives a damn what you think in my head, I never got around to telling what I just told you. And probably if I had even attempted it, it would have been edited and never have seen the light of day. But yeah, that
Wow.
that's the way it was.
Well, we have a question that's come in. I feel like if this is the right time to ask it, to piggyback off of this, if it's okay with you.
Uh-huh.
There's a question: are foreign correspondents often also adrenaline junkies?
I think the best ones are, yeah. I mean, it's not a job for a lazy person.
Right.
Um, Basically, except for the times when I was on my home in my home base, and I had several home bases
Mhm.
over the course of 50 years. Uh, in those cases, I could have more or less regular working hours as any journalist would in any city in America or elsewhere in the world. A regular life where I could have dinner with my kids and my wife, and we could go
Mhm.
out and have a pretty normal life. There were times, of course, when I had to work extended hours. I would have to work the weekend, but not that much. Oh, once I left my home base, as I did constantly, to go to other countries and to cover breaking stories and riots and wars and that kind of thing. Um, you, I worked all the time. I mean, I was exhausted on a regular basis, and I think most of my colleagues were in the same situation. But it wasn't. I didn't have to drive myself to do it because these stories are so intrinsically fascinating,
Yeah.
amazing. You're seeing people at their very best and very worst doing wonderful things, doing horrible things to others. And for me, there was no question that I would stay out and cover this thing until it came to some kind of conclusion, and then I'd go back to a hotel room and stay up half the night writing it, and then be up before dawn to get going again. I
Wow.
loved every minute of it.
I love
So
that.
if that's an adrenaline junkie, I plead guilty.
So I'm curious to see. I think it's unique and special that you and your wife are both coming from the background in journalism. Did that Was that helpful for you? What was that like as a journalist, having your partner also being in the same field?
Well, in our case, it made everything possible for me.
Mm.
And I'm saying that and realizing that it probably sounds kind of nasty to women, um, particularly young women like you, and hopefully
Mhm.
some others who are listening. Um, my wife, as I say, we were classmates at Columbia. She had a lifelong ambition to be a journalist, not a foreign correspondent, but a journalist. I mean, lifelong, starting in elementary school.
Wow.
She wrote articles about her elementary school classmates. Uh, she was on the high school paper. She was the first female editor of the Tufts University Daily, and then went to journalism school at Columbia. So she had this lifelong ambition to be a journalist. I didn't. As I told you, I sort of came into it quite late in my academic career. I was in my early 20s when I realized when Al Seaton, my mentor, showed me the light and showed me that I could do this. Um, so one would say, well, today one would say,
Mhm.
well, your wife Carol, should have been the lead. It should have been her career that you followed, not the reverse. But it was the reverse. Maybe we were just, uh, so much a part of our generation and our time that it was expected that the man would be the principal breadwinner anyway,
Mhm.
and the woman would follow along. Well, Carol followed along, but she also had the unpleasant responsibility or self-appointed responsibility and task of finding a new job everywhere we went. So every 2 or 3 years, we would shift from one country to another. She would drop a job which was promising, which was beginning to blossom,
Mhm.
and then start all over again. It was very, very difficult. In retrospect, very unfair of me. Um, my children, who are not children anymore, um, that are parents themselves, were all born and grew up, uh, at least until college days, overseas. And they recently pointed out to me that I schlepped them all over the world without asking them, was it okay if we left Washington to move to Tokyo
Wow.
after they had spent the last 3 years making friends and enjoying themselves, living in their own culture for the first time. And again, guilty as charged, but that's the way it was.
I mean, I don't think you can ever, in hindsight, you can think about these things, right? But in those moments, it's like what cool opportunities these can be, or
Yes,
right.
yes. And believe me, I've asked my wife with guilt more than a few times, does she regret the way we lived and what she sacrificed for my career? She insists that she doesn't and didn't.
Oh, how beautiful. I love that. So, Mr. Simons, I feel that we have something in common, and I'd love to ask this question because it seems like we both at one point interviewed the Dalai Lama.
Ah,
Of course, you have more experience. I was able to interview him in his birthday when he came to California.
ah,
And so that's my last question for you, because I know we're hitting in the 1 hour mark, and just want to make a reminder to everyone, if they're just joined in, if there's any questions that you do want to ask Mr. Simons, make sure to get those in before this last question, and we'll get that answered for you. And now, so you interviewed the Dalai Lama 4 times during the
mm,
course of your career. He even
mm,
wrote the foreword for your memoir.
yep.
How do you approach an interview with the Dalai Lama, and what did you talk about?
Mm. Before I answer, could I ask you
Sure.
when was it? Do you remember approximately, or the year that you interviewed him was it in LA?
It was in Orange County. It was at the Honda Center,
Okay.
and it was at UCI, which is my
About
alma mater. I want
10
to say
years ago?
about 5 years ago,
5 years ago. Okay.
5, 6 years
Because
ago.
I interviewed him once in at UCLA, but
Wow.
that was a long time before what you're talking about. Yeah. So um, 4 times. The first time I was based in Delhi before my expulsion. I was there for the Washington Post,
Mhm.
and that was 1972, 73, I guess. I decided that I would drive up from Delhi to Dharamsala, where he has his whole life in exile and has been there for 60 years,
Right.
and interview him. Well, at that time, the people still referred to the Dalai Lama in print and in person as a god king,
Mm,
you know, some kind of super human.
right.
And how do you interview a god king? I'm afraid that that first interview was kind of superficial, and probably more political than anything else. The central issue that I was concerned with was he planning to return to China? Did he think there was a chance that Tibet could be separated from the Chinese invaders and so on? But a couple of interesting things happened during that interview. Carol was with me, by the way. And while we were waiting, we were there for a couple of days. And while we were waiting for the interview to happen, we hung out with a lot of young Westerners, Americans, Europeans, a lot of Scandinavians who were there to quite literally sit at the feet of the Dalai Lama and study uh, Buddhism, and smoke a lot of dope. Uh, and when I finished my interview with him, uh, he and Carol and I walked out the back entrance, the back door of his home, and where he had a very beautiful large garden, and there were dozens of these young people, young Westerners that I talked about, and he invited them to approach him and to ask him anything that he might be able to help with. And this, I remember this in particular, this one girl, she was probably 18, 19,
Mhm.
kind of dirty. She'd been obviously knocking around India on a very tight budget for a long time. And she said to him, uh, I'm afraid of dying. I
Wow.
think about it all the time, and it terrifies me. And he very calmly and gently said to her, no, 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 you mustn't be afraid. Dying is just part of death, of life. It happens to everybody. There's nothing to be afraid of. I'm not sure that he convinced her, but it it settled in my mind. The next day, Carol and I got back in our car and drove back to Delhi. We, in those days, of course, without internet and cell phones and so forth, the only way I could communicate with the Washington Post editor was through the Reuters office, the Reuters bureau. So I, the first stop I made when we returned to Delhi was I went to Reuters to pick up my messages, little strips of paper that they ripped off the printer. And the top one was from my mother. My father had died, and I left the next morning for the States, and I just thought it was an amazing irony that
Yeah.
I'd heard the Dalai Lama expounding on death and what it meant, and then I got back and learned this terrible news.
Wow.
Um, the big story that I interviewed him about was well, it was actually not even a story. I I had been in Tibet many years later, doing a long article for the National Geographic, and I spent several months traveling across the Tibetan plateau, and I had an interpreter, a guide, who one day when we were at a certain point on the plateau said to me, we're not very far from where my parents are right now. And he explained that their village, like a lot of small rural villages in Tibet, were abandoned for weeks or a month at a time in the summer, and everybody would go off into the countryside, set up tents, and just have a good time. And he said, we could go there and you could see what this is like. I said, what a great idea. So we went and I met his family, and it was wonderful. And I also met his younger brother, who at that time was 14 years old, studying to be a Buddhist monk. And um, he was fine. He was a kid. He was 14. He said hello, not much more than that. He was riding a motorcycle, roared off, joined a bunch of other kids playing soccer. All was well. So I went back to the States. A month or so later, I returned to Tibet again by chance, bumped into this boy and his father. By this time, the boy was a whole different person. He was crippled, he was
Mm.
paralyzed, he was bent over like a umbrella handle, front to back to front. His spine was diseased, and
Wow.
he was crushing his own organs, and he was going to die. It goes on and on and on. The bottom line is that I managed to get him to New York, where he was he underwent extraordinary 14-hour surgery. His spine was rebuilt by an amazing American um, neurosurgeon, and he returned to a normal life in Tibet. Um, the After all of this was done, the surgeon said to me, this cost the hospital, this was free of charge, you understand.
Mhm.
This cost the hospital $250,000. If there's any way that you can help us recover some of that money, it would be a great thing. So I thought, well, I'm going to go down to Dharamsala again, and I'm interviewing the Dalai Lama to wrap up this story I'm doing. I'm going to ask him if he will introduce me to Richard Gere, who is a disciple of his and presumably has enough money to spare. So I started telling him the story I just got finished telling you, and the Dalai Lama, and he jumped up. He'd been sitting in a big upholstered chair. He jumped up barefoot, and he said, "This can't be. You foreigners, you and the doctor have done so much for this Tibetan boy. I must do something too. I will give you," this is before I asked for Richard Gere, "I will give you 50,000. 50,000 is what he said. So we're in India." And I said, "You mean 50,000 rupees, which would have been about $750. He said, "No, I mean 50,000 US green dollars."
Wow.
I said, "Wow." What do you say? Talking to the God King. I said, "Wait a minute, how do you get $50,000? A terrible question. He said, "I write a lot of books. They make a lot of money." So I come back to the States. I called the surgeon. His name was Fred Epstein in New York. And I said, "Fred, fabulous news. The Dalai Lama is going to give $50,000 to you. Hospital." He said, "I can't take the Dalai Lama's money. I will not take it." So then I'm in the position of calling the Dalai Lama back and saying, "Thanks, but no thanks. The doctor won't take your money." The horrible ending to the whole story is that Fred Epstein, the surgeon, several months later, maybe 6 months later, was out riding his bicycle at his home. The front wheel catches in a hole in the road.
No.
He goes head over tea kettle and fractures his skull and ends up spending the next 10 years of his life as a vegetable.
Oh no. Sometimes bad things happen to good people, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you got it.
Wow, what a story. Oh my goodness. I could listen to all of your stories. I know we've just gone over a little bit over our time, but there's one thing that I always like to ask, especially foreign correspondents, at the end of our interviews is, what does press freedom mean to you?
It means everything to me. It means everything to this country. It means everything to the world. And the terrible moment that we're in is press freedom is disappearing. It certainly has disappeared from places like India, which likes to call itself the largest democracy in the world. And it is disappeared from many countries. Now we've got Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, putting the clamps on journalists in his state. We know that Donald Trump was no friend of the free press, the lying press, as he called it, in a term that he borrowed from the Nazis. So it means everything to me. It means with a free press, people know what's happening in their government. They know what's being done in their name. They know what's being done to them as well as for them. And without it, all of that is lost. And I worry deeply, even at this advanced age and stage of my life where I'm no longer an active reporter, I worry about it a lot. And I think that we need more people worrying about it. And once they worry and understand, to do something about it, because otherwise we're in trouble.
Beautiful. I think it's a perfect place to end the conversation. And just as a reminder, we just had the opportunity to hear about the wonderful career of Mr. Simons, and he does have a book that recently published called "To Tell the Truth: My Life as a Foreign Correspondent." Beautiful. Let's show it to us. I'd be remiss
if I didn't show you, right?
That's beautiful. And I love the tabs in there too.
Yeah, that's my personal copy.
I love that. I love that. So if you have a chance, please get a copy and dive deeper into his story. I really could sit here and go on for hours with you and listen to more of your stories. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.